So I think we finished off on one or two of these slides talking about foodborne diseases. And here, maybe what I'll do is just reduce my volume on my computer so that's not so annoying. And we had talked about traveler's diarrhea and E. coli and a few of the other causes such as Giardia. And I know I showed you this slide as well, just mentioning that we're going to talk about a couple of these things here with Norovirus and Salmonella. And so this is a list I found from Public Health Canada. And actually, interesting enough, it's not the exact same list in the States. So I'm not sure why there's a different distribution of foodborne illnesses, probably something to do with climate or food distribution or something cultural, who knows. Can't quite remember what was on the American list. It was similar. I think there was one thing that was a little bit different, if I recall. So I think I had also showed you these slides and mentioned that, you know, when we talk about food poisoning, sometimes people mean different things, and it's not a very precise word. And so medically, we usually break it into two categories. One, intoxication, which means that the organism itself actually produces a toxin of some sort. So a classic case would be botulism, where you have the organism in the food and it's creating the botulinum toxin, and that's of course causing some paralysis of some sort, right? So that's kind of one of the big ones that would be out there, and this is not that common. So when people usually talk about food poisoning, they mean more of an infection that's found in the food. And so Salmonella would be kind of a big example of that, or Listeria happens sometimes, but most cases, people are, it's Salmonella. Listeria is a little less common and a lot more dangerous in some cases, particularly if you're immunocompromised or old or young or something like that. But Salmonella is a big one, and Campylobacter is another big one, which we're not going to talk about. But let's talk about Salmonella for a couple of minutes here. So I was just thinking about something here I need to do on my computer. Hold on a second. Okay, so Salmonella. We had talked about Salmonella classification a long time ago, way back in the first week of classes, and I'd mentioned that Salmonella, you know, the naming, there's not a lot of agreement on it, even amongst the Salmonella researchers, so I just kind of call it Salmonella. There's a little bit of debate about what's a species and what is a strain, and there's different serovaros, which is just a fancy way to say strain, looking at immunological characteristics and those kind of things. So usually I'll just say Salmonella, but there are different strains that cause kind of different types of infections, right? You may have heard of typhoid fever and whatnot, and those kind of things. But we're mostly talking about the Salmonella that we found in your food, and a common source of Salmonella is chicken. And the reason for that is Salmonella is part of the normal intestinal flora of birds, and also reptiles, by the way. So if you have a pet turtle or a reptile and you handle it with your hands, it's always a good idea to, you know, wash your hands afterwards, because you could get Salmonella infection, right? Same thing with snakes, pet snakes as well, pretty common source of Salmonella infections. But of course, a lot of people eat chicken, and sometimes there's Salmonella found with the meat. And I know there's some debate about whether you should wash your chicken or not, and I think the wisdom now says don't wash your chicken, because of course it's going to splatter that Salmonella all over your kitchen, and we don't want that, do we? So anyway, yeah, I mean, kind of if you cook your food, usually that's kind of one of the main thing, right? I do not recommend eating raw chicken, not at all. So you can see there's some notes here about the bacteria actually survive inside the cells, inside the intestine, and they get in there, and of course they're upsetting the balance, and the balance leads to, you know, all the usual kind of digestive symptoms that you would have, and in some cases it's very, very severe. I remember years ago my sister having this, and I don't remember how long she was sick. It just seemed like a long, long time, you know, with severe cramps and pain, and then all the other stuff, diarrhea, nausea, and those kind of things. So I have a very brief video here to show you. Here it is. It's like 1 minute long. I'm going to play that for you. If I can find the, I don't know why. The video doesn't seem to be. Usually there's a play button here somewhere. Oh, that's too bad. I don't know what happened. It worked for me yesterday. Basically, what he shows in this video is Salmonella goes and it actually goes intracellularly. So it actually goes inside the cell. It goes in by phagocytosis and can live in there. And so it's hard to treat. It's not something that you can treat with antibiotics because the antibiotics don't reach the bacteria. So usually it's one of these things you have to let the infection run its course and make sure the person is rehydrated, and you're gonna treat the symptom. And eventually the body will clear it, right? Those intestinal cells do eventually kind of slough off and get replaced by new cells. And I think that's a big part of the process. So I think the take-home message is cook your food, wash your hands after handling reptiles, right? So that's important to avoid Salmonella. As for the eggs part, I think, again, we've got eggs are from chickens, and they can, in some cases, have Salmonella on them from the chicken feces, right? So I know some people wash their eggs all the time. I'm not sure if that's necessary. I have no idea. I think there's a bit of debate in terms of how eggs should be handled and whether you should eat raw cookie dough and all those kind of things. In fact, eggs are processed very differently in Canada and the US compared to Europe. And I think, so there's debate across the oceans too. So I'm not going to weigh in on that because I don't know enough about it. Although I will confess, I eat raw cookie dough. It's very tasty. There's a little picture there of the Salmonella living inside the intestinal microvilli cells. Like I said, that's a problem because the drugs can't get to it, and so, like I said, you have to sort of let the infection run its course and treat the symptoms. So this is just the table from the textbook, kind of listing some of these organisms that we talked about. So we talked about E. coli 0157 already, and Salmonella, and I'm not going to talk too much about Staphylococcus as being an infectious agent for foodborne infection, but you can see it does happen because it produces toxins that can result in people getting very ill. As for Campylobacter and Shigella, I kind of skipped over those for this course because, like I said, I can't cover everything, but I will say that they're kind of similar to Salmonella and E. coli in that they cause diarrhea, right? And kind of found everywhere and spread by feces. And that's really, most foodborne illnesses are spread by feces in some form or another, whether it's animal or human or both, who knows. So what about viral infections of the digestive system? We already talked about the herpes viruses, herpes simplex 1, herpes simplex 2, so I'm not going to recover that here. I'm going to just mention mumps. So mumps is an infection of the salivary glands, I believe. And I don't know a lot about mumps, but it's just worth mentioning because it is part of the MMVR vaccine and MMRV vaccine. And so it's preventable by vaccination, and it's something that probably most of us will never see in our lifetime as well. Apparently my sister-in-law had this though when she was 14 years old, and I'm not exactly sure the mechanism, but apparently in some cases it can actually mess with your fertility. And of course she's 14 and thinking about getting married someday, and was very concerned about that, but that wasn't an issue. And so she's older than me, so probably it was before the vaccine. I'm not exactly sure when the vaccine came out. Although in some rare cases vaccines don't always work. So I want to talk a little bit about Norovirus. You can see this number here. In Canada, it's probably around 2/3 of all cases of foodborne illness. And I want to talk a little bit about the hepatitises, at least A, B, and C. So Norovirus, you don't want it. That graphic, I think says enough, right? You can see it has many names. I've heard people call it the 2-bucket flu. And of course, usually people take about 2 or 3 seconds to think about 2-bucket flu. What does that mean? Well, okay, just use your imagination or look at that image. It used to be called the Norwalk virus. And you can see the name there, Norovirus. This was named after, I think it's Ohio, Norwalk, Ohio. So, you know, the people there really didn't want a vomiting diarrhea virus named after them. So they eventually renamed it, and now it's mostly called norovirus everywhere you see. Every once in a while, I'll see in the news somebody will slip in and say Norwalk virus instead. I'm seeing in a lot of cases, people are starting to call it the winter vomiting bug the last few years, which is a lot better than stomach flu. Because as I mentioned before, flu kind of gets us mixed up with influenza. So I'd rather not get mixed up with that, because this is definitely a gastrointestinal kind of illness. So I just wanted to point this out. Non-envelope virus. This is a tough virus. It's really stable in the environment, resistant to a lot of disinfectants and hand sanitizers, and it is amazingly infectious. I think 10 virus particles or something like that is the infectious dose. And so being stable in the environment and super infectious makes this thing spread very, very easily through a lot of places. I guess I said some of that stuff already. Usually the symptoms are very acute and short. Like one day is pretty typical, one nasty day, and then that's often it. Sometimes it lingers a little bit longer. Thankfully, is rarely fatal, so that's a good thing about norovirus. I mentioned it's extremely contagious, and there was a case I remember reading a few years ago about somebody who vomited on an airplane, and as a result, 200 people got sick in the next 48 hours. It was just like crazy to read about this case study. You know, how many people got sick from that and got norovirus. So it's very famous for spreading in daycares and cruise ships and homes for the elderly. Like I said, spreads very well. And when you've got these bodily fluids that are messy and expelled violently, in some cases, it spreads very easily. So we try to rehydrate, and that's kind of what we do. I know there are people trying to work on a vaccine for this, but the problem with norovirus is we don't know how to grow it in the lab. We can grow a mouse kind of related virus in mice. In humans, the only way apparently we know how to grow this is in humans, and so there have been studies using human volunteers, and I'm not signing up for that one. So there's a picture you can see, you know, when you Google norovirus, you know, they often make these connections between, like I said, daycares, nursing homes, and cruise ships, and but you know, there's outbreaks all the time, and thankfully it's not usually, like I said, it may be nasty, but you're not usually going to die from it. I think it's very rare to die from it. Sure, everybody has their norovirus stories. So I want to just talk a couple of minutes about hepatitis. I know we haven't really talked about it all semester, but it's worth talking about it because we have two vaccine preventable diseases in hepatitis. And so it's worth talking about it for a minute. It's significant enough. So HEP, by the way, there's my pen is not working. HEP, there it is. HEP means liver, and hepatitis means inflammation. And there's actually lots of causes of hepatitis, chemical and otherwise. But the main causes are various viruses. And when the liver is inflamed, there's quite a variety of symptoms that people can have, digestive symptoms, so nausea and vomiting, and of course in more kind of extreme cases, you're looking at jaundice, and jaundice is kind of a bit of a yellowing of the skin, has something to do with, I'm not exactly sure, I think it has something to do with how the liver processes hemoglobin and causing the yellow color, and so, you know, kind of depending on the source of the hepatitis, this could be very serious or could be not serious at all. So there's a picture of, you know, some hepatitises are associated with liver cancers, and there's somebody there with suffering from liver cancer with dealing with hepatitis B. So it can be quite serious. So there's a whole bunch of hepatitis viruses. I think it actually goes up to G now, or there's some viruses that were kind of hypothetical and haven't been isolated yet. These are the ones that have been isolated. Hard to keep track of them all, but it's worth it to know these are very different viruses. You know, they're all causing something to do with the liver, some inflammation, but very different viruses. You can see we've got RNA viruses, DNA viruses, you know, enveloped and non-enveloped, and so on. So I want to just talk about the ABCs, so virus or hepatitis A, B, and C, because they're the most common and most important ones. So hepatitis A is a foodborne illness, and this is something that in Canada we're not usually too concerned about it. Usually, you know, sometimes there's an odd outbreak at a restaurant here or there, or you know, associated with some contaminated produce or something like that. This is the kind of thing that there is a vaccine available. It's not part of your routine vaccines. It's more considered a traveler's vaccine. So if you're going to go to some place in the world where water and food sanitation is maybe not as good, this is a good vaccine to get. So I think I've got a map here. It's very similar to the map I showed you of waterborne illnesses. Probably no surprise there because of the same issue. You've got water or food contaminated with human feces. Interesting enough, looking at this map, Greenland is in the red zone. So I don't know much about the water treatment in Greenland, but that's just something curious I'd like to learn more about. I think I just want to go back to this slide and point out that it says here, typically causes a mild illness. So this clears up on its own. People get sick for a few days, and that's often the end of it. And with the vaccine, it's totally preventable. So if you're going traveling, you know, and it's you know, sometimes it's worth it to get this shot. It's actually a couple of shots, and so if you haven't had it in many years, they do recommend a booster. So hepatitis B is something we hear about maybe a little bit more often because it is transmitted a bit more often in Canada. And thankfully now we have something else that is preventable by vaccine. So probably, I'm guessing due to your age, most of you are probably vaccinated against hepatitis B. I'm not sure how old all of you are, but I'm not. I'm too old. This was not available when I went through the school system, and so I never ended up getting it. And hepatitis B is transmitted basically in the same way as HIV. So we're talking about, for the most part, sex and intravenous drugs. It's, I believe, very similar to HIV. It's found in seminal fluid and in blood, which explains the similar transmission of this. So hepatitis B, some people actually clear of it, and some people it's a long chronic infection. I don't know a ton about it. I do know it's pretty common in some countries for children to get infected with it just from cuts and scrapes and playing with friends as well. And because they've tested and looked for it and found immunity against it in some cases. So this is kind of the big one, right? Liver failure or liver cancer. And now that we have a vaccine for it, it'd be interesting to see, you know, whether this is just going to go away eventually due to our vaccination methods. So this vaccine is a conjugate vaccine, I believe, and it's a vaccine against one of the surface glycoproteins. So it's not using the whole virus or an attenuated virus. So one more hepatitis worth mentioning is hepatitis C. No vaccine available for this one here. This one used to be very serious, and it was mostly associated with intravenous drug use. I think maybe it's not found in the seminal fluid, is my understanding. So if there is blood-to-blood contact during sex, there is a risk, but very highly linked to intravenous drug use. And the good news about this, though, is this is not very old news. I think this was only about 5 years ago. We now have an antiviral, a cure for this. So, you know, this is something that could also cause liver failure and cancer. And now there's actually a drug for it. I believe Pamela Anderson, I don't know a lot about her. I think she's mostly an actress. I don't know what else she does, but she's been a high-profile advocate of this, and I think she suffered from hepatitis C. So probably she was involved with drug use at some point in her career, we'll call it that. So here's the ABCs of hepatitis. A is a vowel that rhymes with bowel. So I thought I really liked that. This was from the BC Center for Disease Control. And so bowel, of course, is fecal oral, and there is a vaccine and not a chronic disease. B is for bodily fluids, so blood and semen and vaginal fluid, and also a vaccine. And C is for circulation, so just blood. And thankfully now that there's a cure for it. Apparently it's quite expensive, but you know, we do live in Canada, which is wonderful. So that's good that we have a treatment for that, because there's no prevention, and it used to be a chronic infection. Okay, so let's finish off these digestive organisms. I just wanted to mention we talked about several protists and worms that cause digestive diseases. And so there's a little bit of a trend. These are the three main ones we talked about, right? All three of these, by the way, will form cysts or oocysts. So they're quite stable and resistant. I'm not sure about Entamoeba, but Giardia and Cryptosporidium, those cysts are resistant to water chlorination, which is why if you've ever had a boil water advisory, it's probably due to one of those things. These cause diarrhea, and the diarrhea can last a while. So if you come away and you have this, like I said, maybe 2 weeks or more, it's probably not E. coli, it's probably a protozoan diarrhea. The helminths, that includes the tapeworms and a whole bunch of other nasty worms. Usually there's no diarrhea with those. Sometimes people are asymptomatic. Kind of the bigger concerns, or sometimes if there's too many worms in there, you're looking at blockage and maybe cramps and things like that. And maybe other complications, right? With our tapeworms, of course, the pork tapeworm can get into your brain as well, which is not very fun at all. All right, so part 4. I know there's 6 parts, but part 5 and 6 are kind of short. Part 4 is kind of the other big one. We want to talk about urinary tract infections and sexually transmitted infections for a few minutes here. So of course we're talking about the urinary tract, right? That would include the urethra and the bladder, and sexually transmitted infections would include all the reproductive tissues involved in those areas, of course. And there's a huge number of organisms there for some reason that seem to like these body parts and can thrive there, unfortunately. You can see there's a list of organisms. Just looking at the list, I think we've talked about all of them at one point or another. So I'm just going to review a bunch of them right now. So let's talk about urinary tract infections first. So this is going to include the urethra, and if you're really unlucky, it might get into the bladder, or even super unluckily, it might get into the kidneys, which can be painful and dangerous because in those cases, it might spread to the blood. And so we don't want that, that's for sure. So the technical term for bladder infection is called cystitis, and I'm not really sure why that is the case, but there's a term that also means urethra infection as well. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. And then there's sexually transmitted infections as well. And we're kind of, you know, we're trying to use that terminology nowadays rather than STD. And the reason for that is because a lot of these infections are asymptomatic. And of course that means, you know, it's not necessarily a disease, but someone is infected. So that's what we're looking at here. Just give me, oh, never mind, sorry. I'm working at home today, and then my doorbell just rang, and I was just wondering what was going on there, looking out the window. Okay, sorry about that. So let's talk about urinary tract infections. And we've talked about these a number of times already. And you can see this is showing a profile of females and males. And so, you know, from this chart, the people that are most susceptible all their life are the females. Males a little bit more when they're young or getting into later years. And I think I mentioned before that this is just due to anatomy. Sorry, women, your urethra is shorter and it's a little bit closer to, you know, the anus, which, you know, just makes it a little bit easier for the bacteria to migrate from one place to the wrong place. And so, you know, and then the question is, so what is going on here, right? What about infants? And, you know, what about older people? So it probably, you know, has to do with diapers, right? You know, for babies, of course. And also older people, you know, they have depends, which are the adult diapers, which can, you know, which can cause, you know, their urethra to get infected and things to migrate up the bladder.
Blaine?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I turned my volume down. I can barely hear you. I'll turn it back up. Go ahead.
I have a question about like the genomes. So I'm wondering, sorry, I was trying to ask this question earlier, but it didn't really get through because your volume was down. But so you know how we talked about for HIV, like the genomes, like single-stranded RNA. I
Mm-hmm.
noticed for like the HIV, those are there as well. Should we know all the genomes for the exam, or should we know basic information about the
Yeah,
like
good
one?
question. No, no, genomes aren't really that relevant.
Okay, just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing
Well,
with HIV is knowing that it's a retrovirus, right? And that it, you know, will integrate into the host genome, and that's why it's a lifelong infection.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. So these are some of the bacterial causes. There are other bacterial causes. Neisseria gonorrhea can cause urinary tract infections, for example. I think chlamydia as well. But these are some of the common causes. So E. coli and Pseudomonas, you can see, are popping up on that list. And gram-positive staphylococcus. So you can see, like I said, the same organisms seem to pop up again and again and again because they're very good at causing opportunistic infections. So let's talk a little bit about that E. coli. The ones that cause urinary tract infections are called UPEC. So UPEC, of course, stands for uropathogenic E. coli. So I think I mentioned before that not all E. coli strains can do this. They have to have certain virulence factors. And so these virulence factors, the main one is this one here. It's called the P. pili. That P is short for something. And it means it has the ability to actually attach to those tissues. So this is why some people get reoccurring infections. They just have, they're colonized by the right or the wrong type of E. coli. And other people, it's a little bit more rare. If you're a woman, there's a good chance you'll have this kind of infection sometime in your lifetime, and hopefully it's not too reoccurring. I mentioned before that sometimes it's called honeymooner's cystitis, and because sometimes people end up with infections, you know, when they start becoming sexually active. I think I've got a little bit here on this next slide. Maybe I don't. Got a little bit of other information about it, but so again, just due to anatomy, right? You've got the urethra and the vagina and the anus, and they're all in close proximity. So when women become sexually active, it's easier for you know, the bacteria from the one area to get introduced to the other area. So I think I mentioned before, you know, one of the common practices that that is suggested is that women after sexual contact urinate, and that will hopefully clear anything that ended up in the urethra out of the urethra. So symptoms of bladder infections, you know, pain in there, pain when urination, depending on how high it is up in the system, can be quite painful, cloudy urine and those kind of things. In some cases, mild infections will clear on their own. In more serious infections, antibiotics are probably going to be required. And since it's E. coli, it's not necessarily going to work against traditional penicillins. It might work against ampicillin, but there's a bit more resistance to that nowadays. So they're starting to use quinolones. Apparently seems to be where they're going at the moment because they're kind of a little bit newer, and presumably that's why they're working a little bit more. Last thing to say about urinary tract infections is that this is one of these cases where someone may end up with a urinary tract infection, and they take antibiotics, and this may cause a yeast infection because the antibiotics kill the bacteria, kind of, they reduce the normal flora of bacteria and give the yeast a chance to kind of flourish and propagate. And so this is, of course, a side effect of taking antibiotics for some women. So here's basically the same list I gave you before. You can see it's breaking down in gram positives and gram negatives. So on there, E. coli, Pseudomonas, and Staphylococcus are good ones to know. So we're going to talk about sexually transmitted infections. And this is also from the textbook. They're showing a list of a bunch here. The first three are worth talking about. The last three, not that they're not serious, but they're just not half as common. And in fact, you can see chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis are basically the number 1, number 2, and number 3 sexually transmitted infections in Canada. So they're kind of worth discussing, although some may argue that HPV is maybe number 1, but it's not usually counted as much. And I'll talk about HPV in a couple minutes. So let's talk about chlamydia. You probably have seen somewhere, I see it quite frequently in the college, they'll once in a while have posters up warning people about sexually transmitted diseases near the health services. And chlamydia and syphilis are number 1 and number 2. So I don't think this is the exact poster I saw hanging up, but it was similar to the one I saw anyway. And you can see it's talking about people getting tested and those kind of things. We'll talk about that in a moment. First question for you. I'm just wondering if anybody here is from Regina. And usually there's a few Saskatchewaners in the crowd. And the reason why I'm asking that is because a few years ago, they had these billboards up, and they even had it on the buses. So this is, I think, I'm trying to remember what year this was. This was a while ago, maybe even been 10 years ago now. So Regina, at one point, just due to looking at the statistics, they realized they were the chlamydia capital of Canada. And well, okay, they weren't too happy about that. So they put out this advertising campaign and basically to encourage people to get tested. And it worked. The amount of testing went through the roof, and a lot of people got treated. And I believe actually, I think see somebody just commented there from Winnipeg. I think actually the following year, Winnipeg became the chlamydia capital of Canada. So what is going on with chlamydia? The problem with chlamydia is that many people are asymptomatic. I have some numbers here. Apparently half of men and 3/4 of women are asymptomatic. So anytime that something is asymptomatic, we're looking at it can spread very easily. People don't know they have it, all those kind of things, right? It can cause some complications, though. I'll talk about that in a moment. I can see I've got a notice here. It can cause a blindness in infants. So when during childbirth, and so it can be quite serious. But a lot of cases it's asymptomatic, and so it's very easy to spread. So the interesting thing about chlamydia is that we used to think it was a virus because it actually kind of grows like a virus. It grows intracellularly. So you can see these bacteria here, what they're showing is it goes in by phagocytosis, grows in these little membrane-bound compartments called endosomes, and eventually breaks out and gets released. So it looks a lot like a virus in some ways. This is something that we can't culture like a traditional bacterium. We can't just give it food. You have to actually grow it in a cell culture, kind of like a virus too. But we know it as a bacteria. We treat it with antibiotics, and it can be killed very easily. So what kind of symptoms are we looking at? Kind of a lot of similar symptoms for a lot of these sexually transmitted infections. Various types of discolored discharges that people might have from their penis or their vagina. Sometimes pain with intercourse and those kind of things. Sometimes other irritations as well. So you can see on this slide here, it's mentioning one of the big issues with chlamydia is that it can migrate further into the tissues up the reproductive system and actually cause infertility in both genders. So, this is something that, some people, they, eventually get married and they're trying to have children, and they find out they're having reproductive issues, and they get tested and found out that they had chlamydia at one point in their life. And I'm not sure what can be done about that. I don't really know a ton about it. I thought there's something else I was going to say about chlamydia. Diagnosis is usually a urine test, and they're just looking for the bacteria in the urine. And so this is a PCR test using the DNA because we can't culture the organism. Although there is a blood test that can detect to see if you had been infected in the past, and that's a serological test. So treatment, there's a few different treatments, but you can see this is one that at least used to be the standard, one dose of a macrolide antibiotic. So this is something that binds the bacterial ribosomes. And so again, we know it's a bacteria because the treatment works, right? So number 2 sexually transmitted infection is gonorrhea. And we've talked about gonorrhea a handful of times already as kind of being a classic gram-negative diplococci. And so sometimes you'll see in the literature people call it gonococcus. So gono for gonorrhea and coccus because, of course, it's spherical shaped cells. And you can see some of the parallels here. A number of people are asymptomatic, can also cause blindness in newborns, and it's infecting the genitals, although it can also infect other body systems, throat and eyes as well. So symptoms, again, we're looking at very similar symptoms, right? We're looking at various discharges, sometimes pain and irritation during sex or urination. In some cases, apparently this can go up to the kidneys. I don't know a lot about that. That can also cause sterility in both genders. So again, something that's very easily treatable with antibiotics if people can get to it in time. I think I'd also mentioned that apparently gonorrhea is very, very good at picking up DNA from its environment, so it can gain resistance very easily. And so there have been some strains of gonorrhea that have been called superbugs, which is kind of scary. All right, the number 3 sexually transmitted infection I will not have on the exam. I just want to mention it because it is the number 3, and this is syphilis. And the reason why I don't cover syphilis is because it's super complex. It's a good example of a spirochete. So you can see the spiral-shaped organism here. And it's got a funny name, Treponema pallidum. I'm not sure how that's named. It doesn't have syphilis in the name. So it's something that's just too complex to kind of discuss a lot, other than the fact that it's a good example of a spirochete and is the number 3 sexually transmitted infection. Something interesting about syphilis is it is a sexually transmitted disease, but it spreads eventually to other body systems. And way before there were any treatments, this was an issue. People would end up with chronic syphilis. So start off with kind of, sores in the genital area, and then eventually kind of spread into other body systems. So rashes on hands and feet. I think you can add hair loss into this. So I think you may have seen movies, and when the British people are wearing those wigs, they may have been popularized because some people were losing hair due to syphilis, is what my understanding of the whole thing. Later stages, it can actually lead into all sorts of crucial systems and cause, mental impairment and other organ damage. So it can be really nasty. And like I said, before we had treatments, this was something that was really bad. I see somebody has a comment saying, does it make you crazy? I do remember reading somewhere that people used to talk about syphilis of the mind, and meaning that the person has syphilis and eventually they were losing their mind to it. I don't exactly know all the symptoms from it, but I know that traditionally when people had latent syphilis, a lot of them would be institutionalized. I don't know a lot of details of that. And last thing about syphilis that's worth mentioning is that if somebody has this while pregnant, this can get transmitted to the fetus before childbirth and can lead to birth defects and other things. So that's something significant to know. So what about non-bacteria? We've got a few viruses here to mention. Fungi and a protist. So I have a little bit of information about each of these. HIV, I don't know if I even have a slide on this because we just talked about it with the immune system, but I just kind of want to mention these other viruses here. And hepatitis B and C I just mentioned as well a few minutes ago. So let's just talk about herpes and genital warts. So herpes is of course caused by herpes simplex 1 and herpes simplex 2. So herpes simplex 2 is usually the cause of genital herpes and transmitted sexually. It's a lifelong infection like all herpes viruses, but it can be managed using medication. And there's one right there called Herpex. So genital warts are caused by the papillomavirus. Actually, the human papillomavirus, I think there's like 170 types, and they're associated with all sorts of warts, right? It doesn't have to be on the genitals. There are certain ones that are associated with genital warts and are transmitted sexually, and there's another subset of those that are associated with cervical cancer. So we're at the point now where we've had vaccines for human papillomavirus out now, and it's been, I can't remember what year that was, but it's a little bit more than 10 years, and which is amazing how we have seen a big drop in cases of cervical cancer just in 10 years. People thought it would take us 2 decades to get the amount of data to show the effectiveness of this, but the data has been showing that it's helping dramatically, which is awesome. I love to hear success stories like this. So in Canada, I think for the most part now we're using Gardasil because, Gardasil actually protects against more strains. You can see this one here. If you read the box, it says against types 6, 11, 16, and 18. We actually have something called Gardasil 9 now, which protects against 9 strains of human papillomavirus. So I mentioned that maybe papillomavirus is the #1 STI. I've seen numbers that say maybe even 75% of people will have it in their lifetime. Many people don't even know they've had it. You have symptoms or mild symptoms, and so it's very, very, very common. Not usually necessarily reported like the other sexually transmitted diseases. We're keeping good records. This one here, we're not entirely sure, but we do. It's very, very common. So again, who knows? Maybe this profile will change with these vaccines. It's something, be interesting to watch what happens with that over the next few decades. We also talked about yeast infections. We talked about them before. We have Candida albicans, which can cause thrush or vaginal yeast infections, so vaginitis. And this is just something that's part of the normal flora. And if it's given a chance to flourish. So the classical case, like I said, is when somebody takes antibiotics, it gets a chance to flourish and take over. Some women end up with chronic yeast infections and they get them regularly, and often it has something to do with the imbalance of their normal flora in the vagina. I think we've talked about this a lot, so I'm going to move on. So make sure you know the name of the organism, because that has a chance of coming up on the final exam. And we had one protist that is a sexually transmitted infection, and this is Trichomonas. So sometimes people just call it trick. So this trick. Or sometimes I think I've heard it called the trick itch or something like that. This is, again, something that we probably don't have good numbers on this because a large number of people are asymptomatic. Apparently, males rarely have symptoms. I'm not sure whether this can cause fertility complications or not, but I think the main symptoms are itching and weird discharges in women. So it's pretty common, and again, something very treatable by antiprotozoan drugs. We did talk about one multicellular parasite that's a sexually transmitted infection, which is pubic lice, or sometimes known as crabs. And that's what those little things look like. Sure are creepy looking. Okay, so section 5, infections of the nervous system. So we want to talk about that a little bit. Want to make some distinctions though between meningitis and encephalitis. So meningitis is basically an inflammation of the membranes that are surrounding your nervous tissues, surrounding the brain and spinal cord. So if you see here, they're trying to show you that there's this little membrane. It gets inflamed, and it can cause a number of symptoms, including vomiting and fever are pretty common. But since it's affecting the brain as well, it can be more serious, and people can be disoriented and those kind of things. Some cases there are rashes. With bacterial meningitis, there's usually a rash, and I don't really know the mechanism behind that. And in severe cases, you can see here coma, right? So what are some of the causes? I thought I had a slide with the causes. Yeah, okay, I'll come back to that in a moment. Here's I find this one here quite gross. But how does this happen? A lot of meningitis is from normal flora, and the pathogen is just somehow getting into the system. So it can happen. Sometimes people will. Let's say a child is on his bike and falls off his bike or falls out of a tree or something like that. In some cases, we don't even know how the fracture would happen, right? You can imagine, just micro fractures are enough, in the tissues for organisms to get in there. So I just wanted to kind of point out that a number of causes of these are things that we've talked about already. Bacterial meningitis, we've talked about Neisseria meningitidis, and this is something we have a vaccine against. And you can see these three here, in fact, are most of the cases, 70% of cases of bacterial meningitis are those three. And there's a vaccine against Haemophilus as well, so this is kind of good. Streptococcus pneumonia, we do have a vaccine against that, so actually great, we're almost covered. We don't have vaccines against all the strains. The vaccines only protect against some strains. But the usual suspects are here again. We've got E. coli and Staphylococcus, and Listeria is not necessarily a usual suspect, but it can cause bacterial meningitis. So the bacterial meningitis, we can treat with antibiotics, and usually they're diagnosed just getting some spinal fluid in those cases. Viral meningitis, some viruses, herpes viruses and mumps viruses can get in there. I don't know a lot about the diagnosis of them. And of course, there's no specific treatment because we can't use antibiotics for these. So some bacterial infections of the nervous system have toxins, and the two that we talked about were botulism and tetanus. So both of these are spore-forming organisms. Botulism causes paralysis. Tetanus causes muscles to lock into place. So both of them have very potent toxins. We also talked about polio as being a virus that can, in some cases, get into the nervous system and cause paralysis. In most cases, of course, it is either asymptomatic or causing digestive symptoms. And this is, again, something that's preventable by vaccine. So this is good. So let's talk a little bit about encephalitis and what encephalitis is. Encephalitis is an inflammation of the brain. And this picture here is really good because it's important to note that encephalitis is not usually so fatal or serious in young children. And you probably know that, when you're young, your brain is encased in a skull, and the skull is not all one piece. And so these pieces are, they take a few years to fuse together. And so what they're showing here is that if the brain expands and your brain is not fused together yet, it's not so bad. But if you're an adult and you have encephalitis and your brain tries to expand and your skull pieces are all fused together, this can be fatal. And so in some cases, encephalitis is fatal. And so we have to watch for that when we have certain diseases. So several causes. You can see rabies, West Nile virus, trypanosomes, and prions. This is kind of the most significant one in Canada is West Nile virus. We don't have a lot of cases of any of those other things, although they do happen in Canada. But West Nile virus by far is the most significant in Canada. So what kind of symptoms are we looking at? Again, you're dealing with the brain. So all sorts of things that might have to do with cognitive functions, such as confused thinking, apparently seizures, and those kind of things are possible as well. But often with viral infections, we also get fevers and headaches and those kind of things too. So I thought I had something on West Nile virus here. Here it is, West Nile virus, yeah. So just kind of a reminder about West Nile virus, right? It is a bird disease and it's spread by mosquitoes. And sometimes those mosquitoes will bite humans and cause West Nile fever. And so usually we're looking at kind of flu-like symptoms, fever and aches, chills, headaches, and those kind of things. In some cases, people will get encephalitis. And so, if you live in an area where there's West Nile virus, so not northern Alberta, but maybe southern Alberta around Medicine Hat, the doctors know, when it's summer to kind of look out for this, right? And that we can prevent the encephalitis by prescribing corticosteroids, which will kind of reduce the inflammation and save lives. Trypanosomes, there's the African sleeping sickness, which can affect the brain and causes people to go into a coma. It's also spread by an insect. And what about parasites? We have the pork tapeworm. So just a quick reminder of the life cycle of a pork tapeworm. We have the pig, and the pig is here, you can see it's ingesting the eggs from the human, and then those eggs hatch and they turn these little larvae, and the little larvae are all over in the tissues. This human here is eating undercooked pork, and then it grows up into a big worm in the gut. And that's kind of the normal life cycle. The human is not going to get too sick from a full tapeworm, but in some cases, a human may ingest the eggs, maybe self-infect from their own fecal matter, or maybe from somebody they're living with, and those little eggs will hatch in the human and end up as larvae in the tissues. If they're in tissues, not too big of a deal. If they end up in the brain, though, this is obviously very serious and can cause complications and seizures and all sorts of things. So there's a picture of somebody with a pork tapeworm in brain. So I'm not sure if people still watch this show, but if you ever watched the show House with Dr. House, go way back to the very first episode, and it's all about eventually figuring out that the person has a pork tapeworm cyst in their brain. Okay, last one for infection in the nervous system is worth mentioning is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So this is caused in some cases by people, or it's believed anyway. The evidence is pretty strong, but it takes 20 to 50 years for this to manifest itself. It's believed that it's propagated by people eating contaminated meat, so in cows we call it mad cow disease, in humans we call it Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I'm not going to say too much more on that. I know a number of people did their projects on this, and it's really fascinating disease, and you can see it's sometimes called spongiform. And so you can see what we're looking at in the brain is all these plaques, and it makes the brain tissue kind of spongy, which can lead to all sorts of symptoms and dementia and those kind of things. Okay, so the last section here, we want to talk about infections of the circulatory system and systemic infections, which include many of the organisms that we talked about already. I just kind of want to give you a few definitions and remind you of a few organisms, but there's tons of these organisms here. You can see all these are opportunistic pathogens. So Staphylococcus, E. coli, and Streptococcus being the most significant ones. So a word for you is bacteremia. That means that the bacteria is growing in the blood, and this is bad because it's hard to treat, And if you treat it with antibiotics, this can lead to septic shock, which is not good. And I think I have a slide here about septic shock. So septic shock, this is from endotoxin. And usually we're talking about endotoxin from gram-negatives. And this endotoxin is something found in the membrane. So it's a membrane lipid called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. So this is what we mean by septic shock. And you're going to see with toxic shock, the symptoms are kind of similar in a lot of ways. Usually septic shock isn't as serious as toxic shock. It's not quite as strong response, but you can see fever, chills, low blood pressure are kind of the big parts of it. In some cases, a lot more severe symptoms. So toxic shock, here's toxic shock. And we're looking at certain toxins from Staphylococcus and Streptococcus, right? So I mentioned the one, what was it called? TSS. Is it TSST1, I believe it's called, from Staphylococcus aureus. Can't spell today. It's a bit more of a stronger immune response and can, in many cases, be fatal, unfortunately. But so some of the similar symptoms, right? Fever, extreme. In some cases, you're looking at multiple organ failure, which is what's killing a person, unfortunately. And that one's associated often with blood infections and leaving tampons in too long. So there are some diseases in particular, though, that are basically diseases of the circulatory system. And a number of these are transmitted by some sort of insect or arthropod vector. And we talked about plague way back at the beginning. And later on, we talked about Lyme disease, which is obviously very significant in Canada. And this is spread by a tick called the black-legged tick. And so it's infecting the blood, causing rashes, and later symptoms can be a lot more severe if it's left untreated. Plague obviously can be very, very severe, leads to death in many cases if not treated. Another circulatory system infection is mono or infectious mononucleosis. This is actually an infection of the lymphatic system, and this is why people end up with swollen lymph nodes, but you still end up with kind of typical viral symptoms, so fever and chills and swollen lymph glands and those kind of things. And I mentioned before, as a herpes virus, this is highly infectious, so this is human herpes virus number 4, and a very high percentage of people have it. This is the stat I've read a few places that by the time you're 30, you have had a 95% chance of having it. You may not end up with symptoms though. Depending on where your immune system is at the time that you've had it, you could end up with infectious mononucleosis. So you're looking at kind of typical fever and all those symptoms. Sometimes people are asymptomatic, you know, maybe you're fighting off something else and not having a strong immune response. If your immune system is broken down because you're malnourished, in other cases, it can lead to certain types of lymphomas and cancer. So Burkitt's lymphoma is one of the better understood ones. We also talked about HIV as a sexually transmitted infection and an infection that affects the immune system. And so I have this mentioned here because it does infect the blood. And you can see this is talking about acute HIV, so this is kind of a short-term HIV infection, and it looks a lot like mono, swollen lymph nodes, fever, those kind of things. Lastly, we've got malaria and Chagas disease. So these also infect the blood, also spread by insect vectors. Okay, so this is not the end. We're almost there though. Couple more things to talk about, and I want to talk about that exam. And on Thursday, it'll be all review. So let's talk about that in a moment. Just wanted to show you a couple of cool things. I was usually at the end of the semester, I bring you some of my toys and show you some of these things. So, you know, if you're really passionate about microbiology, here's some gift ideas. Christmas is coming up, right? Anyway, so it's unfortunate I can't see you in person to show you some of my toys. If you're looking for something a little nicer, I also have a I usually show off my, my bacteria tie as well. Unfortunately, today I'm working at home and I left my tie in my office. So I'll show you these ones here, and they're very, very nice. All sorts of gifts I found on the internet, which is really cool. So, you know, it doesn't have to be for me. I mean, this can be for anyone that you love, right? If you're looking for something higher end, I thought I would show you these. These are very cool. There's this artist here, Luke something or another, and I don't know how much they are. I'm sure you have to call him for a quote, and he finds microorganisms very beautiful, and he does these sculptures of them. I think they're really, really cool looking. So let's talk about that final exam. I'm actually going to just change PowerPoints because I have more information in this other one. So just bear with me for a second here. I gotta find that share button again. Okay, what did I do here? Sorry, I just have too many documents opened up, and I gotta switch between them and find the right one. Okay, let's talk about that final exam. I'm looking at the time. We have 20 minutes, which is probably enough time for me to get through much of this PowerPoint. And like I said, Wednesday is going to be entirely review. Just thought I'd share with you this Calvin and Hobbes. I thought it was pretty funny, although I may have changed one word in the cartoon. And he says, "Hocus pocus, I want microbiology studying to be done." And then it's not. So poor Calvin, he has to study. So this is what the final is going to look like. It is basically going to be kind of like 2 midterms in terms of length. So the midterms were 40 marks. The final exam is 80 marks. So you'll have 2 hours to do it. And same format we did before. It will be on Moodle using the lockdown browser. There's one new thing I'm adding to this, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, is I'm going to have a table that is a fill-in-the-blank table that's dealing with diseases. So I'll show you what that looks like in a few minutes here. So the other thing to note is mostly we're focusing on the last few topics, which are pretty information dense. I think I mentioned before for the multiple choice section, usually I choose from all topics, so you know, maybe 2 questions from every topic, and then most of the rest of the exam is from the last part. So it's worth it to kind of flip through those first few units, you know, maybe spend an hour or 2 kind of looking through and, you know, maybe brushing up on anything that you kind of didn't get the first time. But I do want you to focus on topics 11 and 14. Obviously, with the last topic, we've covered a lot of diseases, a lot of organisms that were featured in earlier units as well. So just watch for those and anything that I've kind of repeatedly talked about. So Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, E. coli, HIV, and all those things there I've talked about many times. I can't even count how many times. So just some reminders about the lockdown browser. I think last time we had a few more issues than usual. So if you are anticipating any issues, I can probably find you a place on campus, but probably not too many people. I have to look into that. But if you are anticipating any issues, or if you've had a lot of chronic issues with your Wi-Fi at home or whatever, please talk to me and we'll see what we can do about that. So like I said, the usual, like what we did with the midterms. And what I will do sometime in the next day or 2 is I'll put up a sample one so that you can check your technology. I know some people buy new computers halfway through the semester and things like that. So if someone's asking, the short answer and matching will all be from 11 and 14. That's correct.
Blaine,
Yes?
can you skip ahead in your exam, and if you wanted to start with the case studies, like you won't be able to go back? Or like
yeah, you can move around from question to question. I have it programmed so that you can do any section in any order if you like. Yeah.
Awesome.
So just a reminder of what we covered. There's the first 10 topics. And so we had midterm 1 after topic 6, midterm 2 after topic 10. And then more recently, we covered all these topics. All these ones here were about a week each, right? So about 2 lectures. and pretty information dense, which is why we need kind of the first half of the course to really understand these units here. And so, like I said, you definitely want to focus here on your studying. So I wanted to show you a couple of things that some students had done. I know some people are still trying to figure out their studying habits. I had one student show me some of these things she had done, these mind maps, and I thought I'd share them with you. You know, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do notes, and I think it's important that people do notes rather than just reading through material, because when you do notes, you're forming memories in your brain, and that's what you want is memories. And when you do things like this, it's helping to organize things in your brain, which is also a good thing. So she showed me this one here. I like it and I don't like it. Something that my brain doesn't like, and it's probably similar to other people's brains, is I really don't like diagonals. So you can see she has diagonals all over the place. My brain just doesn't like that. So if I were to build this thing, all my lines would be up and down or left and right, probably. But you can see the idea of what she's doing here. I had another student tell me that she loved mind maps, and she found some sort of app that does it, and she shared this with me, and I was just like, wow, that is crazy. Did we really cover all that? Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So I encourage you to take notes. I'll show you a couple more here that some students did. This is somebody here that's looking at the immune system, and she's making notes for different parts, so barriers, phagocytosis, and so on. I'll show you one more that I really liked. This was a student from one of my other classes, from intro biology class, and his goal was to basically try to make a one-page summary of every single topic. And so it took him a lot of time to do so, but then in the end, he only had a few pages to study because by the time he built these pages, he had done a lot of studying. So just some ideas for you. I'm a big believer in pen and paper over typing things, but you know, whatever works for you. You talk to your friends and your classmates. You'll probably find everyone has different ideas of what works for them. And different people have different brains, of course. So topic 11, we looked at disease transmission and epidemiology. So lots of words to know: endemic, epidemic, pandemic. Some of the key concepts in this topic were around these things: sources of organisms, modes of transmission, and the susceptible host we didn't cover quite as much. We talked about a little bit. So I just want to talk about this here a little bit because I've had a couple of people ask me about sources of organisms. And when I say sources of organisms, I mean, where do these things live in the wild? Where do they come from? And the word for this is reservoir. And so there were 4 reservoirs that we talked about. They can come from normal flora, other humans, they can come from animals, or they come from abiotic sources. And you can see there's some examples of each of those there. So when I say sources, that's what I mean. I know that last year I actually had that question on the final exam. I said, you know, what are the 4 sources of organisms? Give examples. And a certain subset of people wanted to just tell me about human to human diseases. And so they were just getting 1 out of 4 on that. Someone's asking if this PowerPoint is on Moodle. Yes, I just put it up probably around 10:25 just before class. Click on exam and it should be there. So modes of transmission, several modes of transmission. So make sure you know examples of each of these. And you know, I think I've got a sample question right here. So you might see a sample question that looks something like this. It says here, which of the following diseases have similar means of transmission? So West Nile fever and malaria. So that would be mosquito and mosquito. So that's probably the right one. I didn't mean to put the right answer first. I wanted to discuss all of them, but I guess I made that one easy for you. So there you go. There's the right answer. Most of these other ones here, these are all things we talked about. So if you don't know what some of these things are, you're gonna have to go back and review what they are. Some of the exam will be kind of short answer or fill in the blank style questions, some written. So it might be, you know, here's some examples, right? Sometimes I ask for examples of things. So give 2 examples, or sometimes I ask for kind of more, you know, definition type or explanation type questions. So this is saying, what is a fomite? So fomite, of course, is some sort of object that can carry a pathogen. Examples, if you know what it is, pretty easy common examples. You can look at drinking glasses, doorknobs, cell phones, you name it. So topic 12 was on microbiomes, health and disease. So the first part we were talking about microbiomes and lots of questions around them. You know, where do these things live? Are they helpful? Are they harmful? And so there's a little bit in both categories. So how do they help us? How do they harm us? And we also talked about probiotics. So here's a sample question. It says here, resident microbiota are typically found in all the following locations except. So lower digestive tract, definitely there's lots of organisms there. Lower respiratory tract, probably not, but let's just look at the other ones. Upper respiratory tract, so that would include your mouth, and so there's definitely organisms there. Digestive tract, vaginal mucosa, so lots of organisms there. So right answer is this one here. All right, the lungs generally are microbe-free unless you're sick. Probably not 100% microbe-free. If we looked really hard using newer DNA methods, we could probably find something, but very, very few organisms. True or false? It is possible to be infected but not diseased. So the answer is true. Remember Typhoid Mary? And so, you know, and also all the sexually transmitted infections that we were just talking about. So also in topic 12, a big part of topic 12 was this whole thing here called the mechanisms of pathogenicity. This is something that every year I try to figure out how to ask you questions about this because there's so much information, right? If you look at all these things, portals of entry, how they adhere, how they evade the immune system, all those kind of things. So my best advice for studying this part is to go through and know examples from each of these, A, B, all the way to F, right? So know examples, and by examples, I don't just mean, you know, infections can be transmitted, you know, let's say sexually, or let's say by fecal oral route. Know the names of the organisms as well, right? That would be an example. So if I ask you for an example of a foodborne infection, don't just say traveler's diarrhea, right? You want to give me an example of the organism that causes traveler's diarrhea as well, okay? So this is the kind of thing where usually I'll have a few questions asking around examples, for you to give examples to me. So make sure you know some examples, please. So here's one here. It says, give 2 examples of exotoxins. And so here's some examples. And I'm just trying to think, we actually talked about a few other exotoxins. We talked about the diphtheria exotoxin and the tetanus on there. Yes, I do. So, you know 2, we've talked about at least 6. So hopefully that will, you know, something like that. These are the type of questions I would ask you about that. What are some claims of probiotic products? So that could be another short answer type question. So it doesn't have to be full sentences for my exams, but here are some claims. Maybe the question might be a little different. Maybe I'd ask, what are the claims? And is the claim legitimate, right? And in these cases of these 3, kind of in this order, you know, the digestive claims are stronger than any of the other claims. But all of these, there is a little bit of science behind them, and maybe in the future we'll know more about it and know better ways to use probiotics. So topic 13 was the immune system. So we talked about 3 types of barriers or lines of defense. The first line of defense was mostly physical barriers, so it included the skin and secretions of the skin. So know what these things are, salt and lysozyme and sebum and those kind of things. Second line of defense is, of course, processes and cells in the blood. So the processes that we kind of focused on, we talked about inflammation, we talked about phagocytosis, dendritic cells. Those were kind of some of the big ones that were important for this unit. Somebody's asking, when you say some, how many are you expecting when I say examples? It kind of depends on the category. In some categories, there's lots of examples, so I could ask you for 4. but I would say for most things, know a minimum of 2 examples. Third line of defense was adaptive immunity. So we're looking at B cells and T cells and all of the things that they do. So there's a very quick summary slide talking about humoral immunity and cell-mediated immunity. So this is something I'm going to kind of go over a lot more detail on Wednesday. So remember, the humoral immunity is B cells, and the B cells, of course, are against extracellular pathogens. So we're looking at bacteria and some viruses and toxins. Whereas T cells, you can see they're talking about infected cells, so with viruses, cancers, and transplant tissues. I didn't mention transplant tissues, but I also said large parasites, so large worms is usually what we're looking at for cell-mediated immunity. So like I said, on Wednesday, I'm gonna go over this and review these 2 types of immunity in more detail. We talked about vaccines, many types of vaccines. These are the 4 classical types. I introduced 2 new types of vaccines, RNA vaccines, and what was the other one? Virus-like particles. And those are vaccines that are just on the edge of being approved for human use because of the new because of the pandemic with COVID-19. So immune system disorders. I've had a few questions about this already, about what you need to know about these hypersensitivities. So you need to know some examples. You don't need to know about the mechanisms of these things. There's the 4 different types and they have different mechanisms. Don't worry about that. Know some examples of different types of allergic diseases. Know that it's a hypersensitivity. Know some examples of some autoimmune diseases as well. I think last year I had a true and false question, and the true and false question was an allergy is an immunodeficiency, and a lot of people got that wrong. It's a hypersensitivity. Somebody's asked them at the review class on Thursday. Yes, Thursday, not Wednesday. Sorry, get my days of the week mixed up. I have a review class for another class on Wednesday if you want to come to that. Immunodeficiencies, we focused on HIV and AIDS. So you'll want to know a little bit about AIDS, diagnosis, symptoms, those kind of things. I think I've got a multiple choice question here. So it says here, which of the following is not considered part of a clinical AIDS diagnosis? So increase in number of white blood cells, detection of antibodies against HIV, unexplained weight loss, a decrease in CD4 cells, presence of certain rare diseases. And so here is the key word, is increase. Right? It's actually a decrease in the number of white blood cells. Okay, a couple minutes left here. We finished up right away here for today. And like I said, Wednesday will be all review. And if you have something in particular that you want to go over on Wednesday, please let me know. I'm going to send something out by email later today about Wednesday and for people to look at and give me feedback for Wednesday. So 14 was infections of the body system, and a whole bunch of infections we talked about. This is not necessarily everything we talked about, but just a nice little infographic I found on the internet of bacterial infections. And so like I said, you can sort of classify infections as bacterial or viral or respiratory, or, there's lots of different ways to look at them. So what I do recommend for the final exam is that you go through and make a list of the organisms that we talked about, and you can classify them as bacteria or viral or by body system, and make those notes about them. They're going to help you with this big fill in the blank question, which I'll show you in a moment here. There's some viral infections, some protist and worm infections, some fungal infections. This is just looking at skin infections. It doesn't have thrush or vaginitis on it. So true and false, I want to show you, I'll let you read that if you want, but what I want to do is show you this fill in the blank question before we finish up today. So I'm going to have a fill in the blank table. It's going to look something like this. Basically with these 4 headings, there's going to be 10 diseases on it. So it's going to be worth 10 marks. And what you need to do is basically fill in the missing information. So it's going to have the organism name. Maybe this should say name, organism name will be one place. The disease it causes will be another. Classification, so you got to tell me, is it a bacteria? Is it a prion, a virus, a protist, or a worm? And then the infected body system. And so, like I said, this will be 10 marks. And you'll have to, yes, you'll have to fill this in. I know somebody's asking about that. No, there's no drop down menu on this that I can, I got to look at this and see how I can program this. I haven't figured that part out yet. But I may just have the table and you have to fill in A, B, C, and so on or something. So here's some examples. Beef tapeworm. So the beef tapeworm, of course, is a helminth. I guess I've written eukaryote. I meant to put helminth there. And it infects the digestive system. HIV, the disease is AIDS, and it infects the immune system. The rhinovirus, and remember rhino means nose, so this causes the common cold. And this one, at least it says virus in the name, so you can give me that. And COVID-19, of course, the virus name is SARS-CoV-2, and it's a respiratory virus, system virus. In some cases, there might be more than one answer. Like if I asked you about traveler's diarrhea, there's more than one organism that can cause traveler's diarrhea, so there might be more than one answer for that one. I was going to show you this previous slide here. There will be some examples of short answer questions, and we can certainly talk about this on Wednesday. And I think I've got one or two more slides. This is it. This is the last slide. So I guess, yeah, this isn't quite the end. Wednesday will be the end, but just want to thank everybody for a great semester. I enjoy this stuff very much. And you know, if you see me out in the community or the college in the future, you know, say hi to me. Let me know you're in my class because, you know, I didn't get the chance to meet most of you in person, and I would love to hear about your experiences, you know, in the nursing program and in the hospitals and things like that. I'll see you on Wednesday. Like I said, look for the package I'm going to send out later today, and we'll review some things on Wednesday or Thursday. Thank you, on Thursday. So have a great day, and we'll see you then.